The screams pierced the peaceful afternoon air as Lily Jenkins frantically ran along the riverbank, her eyes fixed on the small head bobbing in the rushing waters. Her 5-year-old son Thomas had been playing by the edge of the North Platte River just moments ago, and now the spring current was carrying him away, his little arms flailing desperately as he fought against the unforgiving force of nature. "Help! Please, someone help!" Lily's voice broke as she stumbled over rocks, trying to keep pace with the current that was stealing her child. Her skirts were heavy, her boots slipping on the muddy bank, and terror gripped her heart like a vise. "Thomas, hold on, baby." It was 1875 in Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory, and the town was bustling with its usual afternoon activities when disaster struck. The river that had sustained the community and served as a vital artery for trade had become a monster threatening to take what Lily loved most. Preston Evans had just finished delivering supplies to the general store when he heard the commotion. Standing at 6 feet tall with broad shoulders honed from years of hard labor, the 30-year-old cowboy dropped the receipt he'd been examining and sprinted toward the sound of distress, without a second thought. When he reached the riverbank and saw the child being swept downstream, Preston didn't hesitate. He threw off his hat, kicked off his boots, and dove into the icy water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he pushed through it, his powerful arms cutting through the current as he swam toward the boy. "I'm coming," he shouted, though he doubted the child or his mother could hear him over the roar of the water. Lily watched in disbelief as the stranger plunged into the dangerous river. Her heart pounded in her chest as she continued to run alongside, praying this man could reach her son before it was too late. The seconds stretched like hours as she watched the distance between the cowboy and Thomas slowly close. Preston could feel the current fighting him, trying to push him off course, but he kept his eyes fixed on the small figure ahead. The boy was starting to tire, his head dipping below the surface more frequently. With one final surge of effort, Preston reached out and caught the child's arm, pulling the boy against his chest. "I've got you, son," he gasped, turning onto his back to keep the boy's face above water. "Just hold on to me." Thomas coughed and sputtered, clinging to Preston's shirt with tiny, trembling hands. Now came the harder part, fighting the current to get back to shore. Preston kicked with all his might, angling toward the bank where he could see the boy's mother running alongside, her face streaked with tears and hope. "There's a bend coming up," she shouted, pointing ahead. "The current slows there," Preston nodded, conserving his breath for the struggle. His muscles burned with exertion, but the weight of the child against him gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. As they approached the bend, he felt the pull of the water lessen just enough for him to make headway toward the shore. Lily splashed into the shallows, reaching out with desperate hands as Preston maneuvered toward her. When they were close enough, she grabbed her son, pulling him to her chest as Preston dragged himself onto the rocky bank, collapsing in exhaustion. "Thomas, oh God, Thomas," Lily sobbed, running her hands over her son's face and body, checking for injuries. The boy was shivering and frightened but appeared unharmed. You're okay now." Preston lay on his back, chest heaving, staring at the sky as water dripped from his soaked clothes. He'd never felt cold like this before, but the relief of seeing the boy safe in his mother's arms washed over him with more warmth than any fire could provide. "Thank you," Lily said, turning to him with eyes shining with tears. "You saved him. You saved my son." Preston managed to sit up, pushing wet hair from his face. "Anyone would have done the same, madam," but they both knew that wasn't true. Many men wouldn't have risked their lives for a stranger's child, and even fewer would have succeeded against such a powerful current. "I'm Lily Jenkins," she said, still holding Thomas tight against her. "And this is my son, Thomas." "Preston Evans," he replied, extending a dripping hand which she took without hesitation. "Pleased to meet you both, though I wish it had been under different circumstances." A small crowd had gathered now, townspeople rushing to help. Someone draped a blanket over Thomas and another over Preston's shoulders. Questions flew and offers of assistance, but Lily couldn't take her eyes off the man who had saved her world. "We need to get you both warm and dry," she said finally. "My home is just up the hill. Please, let me offer you at least that much." Preston hesitated, aware of how it might look a single man accepting an invitation to a widow's home, for he had noticed her lack of a wedding ring. But the genuine gratitude in her eyes and his own shivering convinced him to accept. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. I'd be much obliged." "It's Miss Jenkins, actually," she corrected gently. "But please call me Lily." As they walked toward her modest home on the outskirts of Fort Laramie, Preston couldn't help but notice how Lily Jenkins carried herself with dignity despite her obvious distress. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in damp tendrils around a face that spoke of both hardship and resilience. She wasn't classically beautiful, but there was something captivating about her green eyes and the determined set of her jaw. For her part, Lily was acutely aware of the tall stranger beside her. Despite being soaked to the bone, he walked with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. His brown hair curled slightly as it dried, and his eyes, a deep blue like the Wyoming sky, held a kindness that matched his brave actions. Thomas had calmed somewhat but refused to leave his mother's arms. Over the child's head, Lily's gaze met Preston's, and in that moment, an unspoken connection formed between them, the kind that can only be forged in the crucible of shared danger and relief. Neither could have known then how profoundly this chance meeting would change their lives. Lily's home was a small but well-kept cabin with a vegetable garden out back, and a few chickens pecking in the yard. Inside, it was neat and modestly furnished, with touches that spoke of a woman making the best of limited circumstances: hand-sewn curtains, a carefully mended quilt, shelves lined with preserved foods. "The fire's still going," she said, setting Thomas down near the hearth. "Let me get some towels and dry clothes. I have some things that belong to my brother that might fit you." While she bustled about, Preston crouched down next to Thomas, who was watching him with wide, solemn eyes. "That was quite an adventure we had, wasn't it?" Preston said gently. Thomas nodded, clutching his blanket tighter. "I was scared." "Me too," Preston admitted. "Rivers can be mighty dangerous. What were you doing down there, if you don't mind my asking?" "I was trying to catch a frog," Thomas whispered. "Mama told me not to go near the water alone, but I saw it jump and—" His lower lip trembled. "I'm sorry." "Well, you've learned an important lesson today," Preston said, keeping his voice free of judgment. "And I reckon your mama's just glad you're safe now." Lily returned with towels and clothes, having heard the exchange. "That's right," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "But we're going to have a serious talk later about following rules, young man." Thomas hung his head, and Preston felt a surge of sympathy for both mother and child. The boy had nearly paid the ultimate price for a moment of childish curiosity, and Lily had been forced to confront every parent's worst nightmare. "Here," Lily offered Preston a bundle of clothes. "You can change in the back room. I'll make some hot coffee." The clothes, a simple shirt, trousers, and suspenders, were slightly short in the arms and legs but otherwise fit well enough. When Preston emerged, Lily had changed as well, into a simple blue dress, her hair now tied back neatly. Thomas sat at the table wrapped in a quilt, sipping from a mug of warm milk. "Thank you for the clothes," Preston said, sitting at the chair she indicated. "It's nothing compared to what you did," Lily replied, pouring coffee into a chipped but clean mug. "If you hadn't been there." She couldn't finish the sentence. "But I was," Preston said simply. "And he's fine. That's what matters." As they drank their coffee, Preston learned that Lily had moved to Fort Laramie 3 years ago after her parents died of influenza back east. Her brother had been in Wyoming Territory, working as a surveyor for the railroad, and had sent for her. But just 6 months after her arrival, he'd been killed in a construction accident, leaving her alone with 2-year-old Thomas. "Thomas's father?" Preston asked carefully. "A brief marriage before I came west," Lily said, her tone making it clear she preferred not to elaborate. "He's not in the picture." Preston nodded, respecting her privacy. "And you've been managing on your own since then." "I take in laundry and do mending for folks in town," she explained. "And I help Mrs. Calloway at the boarding house 3 days a week. We get by." There was pride in her voice, despite the obvious challenges of her situation. "That's admirable," Preston said sincerely. "Not everyone has that kind of strength." A faint blush colored her cheeks at the compliment. "And you, Mr. Evans, what brings you to Fort Laramie?" "Preston, please," he corrected with a smile. "I work for the Blair Cattle Company, driving herds up from Texas. We delivered a shipment of cattle to the Army post yesterday, and I'm staying in town for a few days before heading back." As they talked, Thomas's eyelids began to droop, the excitement and trauma of the day catching up with him. Lily excused herself to put him to bed, and Preston took the opportunity to study the small home more carefully. On the mantel sat a daguerreotype of a younger Lily standing beside a tall man who shared her features, her brother, he presumed. Next to it was a child's drawing, colorful and chaotic in the way of all children's art. When Lily returned, she seemed momentarily unsure of herself, as if the absence of her son had removed a buffer between them. "I should be going," Preston said, rising to his feet. "My clothes are probably still soaked, but please keep those," Lily interrupted. "They're just gathering dust here. Besides, I owe you far more than a set of old clothes." "You don't owe me anything," Preston insisted. "I'm just glad I was there." Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. There was a tension in the air, not unpleasant but charged with something neither was ready to name. "At least let me walk you to town," Lily offered, breaking the silence. "It's the least I can do." "That's not necessary, I insist," she said firmly. "Mrs. Hollister from next door can listen for Thomas. He'll sleep for hours after today's excitement." Recognizing her determination, Preston nodded. "All right, but only if it's no trouble." The evening air had cooled, and the setting sun painted the western sky in hues of orange and purple as they walked. Preston carried his damp boots and hat, preferring to go barefoot rather than pull them onto his dry feet. "It's beautiful here," he remarked, looking out over the landscape. "Different from Texas, but beautiful in its own way." "I thought I'd hate it when I first arrived," Lily admitted. "It seemed so vast and empty compared to Philadelphia, but now I can't imagine living anywhere else. There's a freedom here that gets under your skin." Preston nodded in understanding. "That's how I felt the first time I rode out on the open range. Like I could breathe for the first time." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the distance between their shoulders gradually diminishing until they were close enough that their arms occasionally brushed. Neither acknowledged it, but neither moved away either. "How long will you be staying in Fort Laramie?" Lily asked finally. 3 more days, Preston replied. "Then it's back to Texas until the next drive." Lily nodded, trying to hide her disappointment at the shortness of his stay. "Well, if you'd like. That is, I'm sure Thomas would love to thank you properly once he's recovered from today. Perhaps you could join us for supper tomorrow," Preston smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I'd like that very much, Lily." As they reached the edge of town, they paused, both reluctant to end their time together. "Until tomorrow, then," Lily said, extending her hand. Preston took it, holding it perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Until tomorrow." They parted ways, each glancing back at the other as they walked in opposite directions, unaware that this chance encounter born of crisis and courage had set in motion a chain of events that would transform their lives in ways neither could have predicted. The next morning dawned clear and bright over Fort Laramie. Preston woke early in his rented room above the saloon, the events of the previous day still vivid in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about Lily Jenkins and her son, how frightened she had looked as she ran along the riverbank, how relieved when he'd brought Thomas safely to shore. And later, the quiet strength she displayed as she spoke of building a life for herself and her son in this frontier town. He dressed with more care than usual, selecting his least worn shirt and taking extra time with his shaving. As he examined his reflection in the small, spotted mirror, he felt a twinge of self-consciousness. It had been a long time since he'd cared what a woman thought of his appearance. After breakfast at the hotel restaurant, Preston headed to the general store. If he was going to dinner at Lily's home, he wouldn't arrive empty-handed. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. "Morning, Mr. Evans," greeted Albert Miller, the storekeeper. "Heard about your heroics yesterday. The whole town's talking about it." Preston shrugged uncomfortably. "Just did what needed doing." "Not everyone would have," Miller replied, leaning on his counter. "Lily Jenkins is well respected around here. Hard-working woman, keeps to herself mostly. Town's mighty grateful to you for saving her boy." Preston nodded in acknowledgement but changed the subject. "I'm looking for a small gift, something suitable for a young boy and maybe something for his mother as well." Miller's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment on Preston's intentions. "For the boy, we just got in some carved wooden animals, made by an old fellow over in Cheyenne. Quality work." He led Preston to a display case. The animals were indeed finely crafted horses, buffalo, bears, each one detailed and smooth to the touch. Preston selected a horse, its posture proud and running. "And for Miss Jenkins," Miller prompted. Preston hesitated. "Something practical but nice." After some consideration, he settled on a small bottle of lavender water, a modest luxury for a woman who likely had few indulgences, and an illustrated book of children's stories for Thomas. As he paid for his purchases, Miller wrapped them carefully in brown paper. "Will you be staying in Fort Laramie long, Mr. Evans?" "Just a few more days," Preston replied. "Then back to Texas with the Blair outfit." Miller nodded sagely. "Pity. Seems to me a man who'd jump into the North Platte during spring runoff to save a child might be the kind of man we could use around here." Preston made a noncommittal sound, but the storekeeper's words lingered in his mind as he left the store. He hadn't thought about settling down anywhere in years. The life of a drover suited him: open skies, constant movement, no attachments. But lately, he'd been feeling the wear of the endless miles, the sameness of one cattle drive after another. At 30, he was younger than many men who worked the trails, but old enough to have seen friends settle into ranching, storekeeping, or family life. Sometimes, in the quiet hours around the campfire, he'd wondered what such a life might be like. Shaking off these uncharacteristic musings, Preston decided to take a walk around Fort Laramie to pass the time until his dinner engagement. The town had grown considerably since it had transitioned from a military post to a civilian settlement. There were proper businesses now, homes with fenced yards, even a small school. It wasn't as rough as some of the cow towns he'd passed through, nor as refined as the bigger cities back east, but it had a solidity to it, a sense of permanence. As he walked, several people nodded or tipped their hats to him, a few stopping to shake his hand and comment on his rescue of Thomas. Word traveled fast in small towns, and Preston found himself uncomfortable with the attention. "Mr. Evans." He turned to see Thomas running toward him, Lily following at a more sedate pace. The boy looked none the worse for his adventure the previous day, his face bright with excitement as he skidded to a stop in front of Preston. "Mama said we're having you for dinner," Thomas announced, then frowned. "I mean, you're coming to dinner. We're not eating you," Preston laughed, crouching down to the boy's level. "I'm mighty glad to hear that. I don't think I'd taste very good." Thomas giggled, and Preston was struck by how resilient children could be. Yesterday, this boy had nearly drowned. Today, he was laughing in the sunshine as if it had never happened. "I hope we're not interrupting your day," Lily said as she joined them. She wore a simple calico dress, her hair neatly pinned, a market basket over her arm. "Not at all," Preston assured her, standing up. "I was just exploring the town. Thomas insisted we come to town for supplies today rather than tomorrow," Lily explained with a significant look at her son. "I think he was hoping to run into you." "Were you now?" Preston asked, amused. Thomas nodded vigorously. "I wanted to say thank you for saving me from the river. And also, I wanted to ask if you've ever shot a real gun, because Jimmy Patterson says his pa lets him shoot his rifle, but I think he's lying because he's only 6 like me." "Thomas," Lily admonished, "that's not an appropriate question," but Preston just smiled. "Yes, I've shot real guns. It's necessary in my line of work. But your mother's right, guns aren't toys, and most men wouldn't let their 6-year-old sons handle them." Thomas looked simultaneously disappointed and vindicated. "I knew Jimmy was lying." "We should let Mr. Evans continue his walk," Lily said. "We'll see him this evening." "Actually," Preston found himself saying, "if you don't mind the company, I'd be happy to help with your errands." Lily looked surprised but pleased. "We wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," he assured her. "Unless you'd prefer to shop alone." "No," she said quickly, then more composedly, "no, company would be nice. We're just picking up flour, sugar, and a few other things." Thomas immediately grabbed Preston's hand, tugging him toward the general store. "Mr. Miller has candy sticks. Do you like candy sticks?" "Thomas," Lily sighed, "Mr. Evans doesn't need to hear about candy." "Actually," Preston said with a conspiratorial wink at Thomas, "I'm quite fond of candy sticks, especially the peppermint ones." Thomas beamed, and Lily gave Preston a look that was partly exasperated and partly grateful. As they walked together toward the general store, Preston was acutely aware of the picture they must present like a family out for a day of shopping. It was a role he'd never played before, yet it felt surprisingly comfortable. Inside the store, Miller raised his eyebrows at seeing Preston return so soon and in such company, but greeted them warmly. As Lily selected her purchases, Preston entertained Thomas by showing him different items around the store, explaining their uses and occasionally sharing a story about his travels. "And this," he said, pointing to a strange metal contraption, "is a cream separator. It divides the cream from the milk so you can make butter more easily." "Have you ever made butter?" Thomas asked, wide-eyed. "Once or twice when I was about your age," Preston admitted. "My mother kept a cow, and it was sometimes my job to churn the butter." "We don't have a cow," Thomas said thoughtfully, "but Mrs. Hollister does. Sometimes she gives us milk." "That's very generous of her," Preston replied, noting how even this small detail revealed the network of support and neighborly assistance that seemed to define life in communities like Fort Laramie. When Lily had finished her shopping, Preston insisted on carrying her purchases. As they left the store, Thomas spotted some friends playing marbles in a patch of dirt and looked questioningly at his mother. "Go ahead," Lily nodded. "But stay where I can see you and come immediately when I call." As Thomas raced off, Lily turned to Preston. "Thank you for being so patient with him. He can be inquisitive." "He's a fine boy," Preston said sincerely. "Smart and curious. That'll serve him well as he grows up." Lily smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. His father was like that, always asking questions, wanting to understand how things worked. She rarely mentioned Thomas's father, and the word seemed to surprise even her. "May I ask what happened?" Preston ventured carefully. "Between you and his father." Lily was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas play with his friends. "We married young. I was just 18. Daniel was charming and full of big dreams, but he was also restless. When I told him I was expecting, he wasn't ready to be a father. He left Philadelphia before Thomas was born. The last I heard, he'd gone to California." "I'm sorry," Preston said, genuinely moved by her story. She shook her head. "Don't be. It was hard at first, but I've made peace with it. Thomas and I, we're a family. We have each other. Still, raising a child alone can't be easy." "It isn't," she admitted. "But we manage. And we're not really alone, not here. Fort Laramie has been good to us." They stood in companionable silence, watching Thomas laugh with his friends. After a moment, Lily spoke again, her voice softer. "What about you, Preston? Have you ever thought about settling down? Having a family?" The question caught him off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it touched on thoughts he'd been having himself earlier that day. "I suppose I always assumed I would someday," he said honestly. "But the years have a way of slipping by when you're on the trail. There's always another drive, another season, and then you look up one day and realize 10 years have passed." Lily nodded in understanding. "Life rarely turns out the way we expect, does it?" "No," Preston agreed. "But sometimes that's not such a bad thing." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of shared experience, of mutual understanding that went beyond their brief acquaintance. The connection was broken by Thomas's return, his hands dusty from play. "Can Mr. Preston come see our chickens before dinner?" he asked eagerly. "If Mr. Preston would like to," Lily replied, looking to him for his response. Preston smiled, finding himself genuinely curious about Lily and Thomas's home life. "I'd be delighted to meet your chickens." Thomas cheered, and the three of them made their way back toward Lily's cabin, the boy chattering excitedly about his favorite hen, Bessie, who laid eggs with 2 yolks almost every time. As they walked, Preston felt a strange contentment settle over him. The bustle of Fort Laramie, the vast Wyoming sky overhead, and beside him this remarkable woman and her enthusiastic son, it all combined to create a sense of rightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. For her part, Lily found herself studying Preston when he wasn't looking, the way he listened attentively to Thomas's endless questions, the gentle humor in his eyes, the strength evident in his movements. He was unlike any man she'd known, combining capability with kindness in a way that was increasingly rare in her experience. By the time they reached her small home, with its neat garden and clucking chickens, Lily was forced to admit to herself what she had been trying to ignore. She was drawn to Preston Evans in a way that both excited and terrified her. And as she watched him crouch beside Thomas to admire Bessie the hen, she wondered if perhaps he might feel something similar toward her. The afternoon passed pleasantly as Preston helped Thomas collect eggs and assisted Lily with preparing dinner. His skills in the kitchen were limited, but he followed directions well and seemed genuinely happy to be included in their routine. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Lily set out a simple but hearty meal on her small table: a chicken stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and preserved peaches for dessert. Thomas said grace, adding a special thank you for Mr. Preston saving me from the river, which brought a lump to Lily's throat. The conversation flowed easily over dinner, with Thomas providing much of the entertainment with his stories about school and his friends. When the meal was finished and Thomas had been sent to wash up for bed, Preston retrieved the packages he'd bought earlier. "I brought a few small tokens," he said, suddenly feeling shy as he handed them to Lily. "It's nothing much." Lily opened the paper carefully, gasping softly when she saw the lavender water. "Preston, this is too generous, please," he insisted. "It reminded me of you, simple but lovely." Her cheeks flushed at the compliment, and she thanked him with a warmth that made Preston's heart beat faster. Thomas was equally delighted with his gifts, immediately pronouncing the wooden horse the best toy ever, and begging for a story from his new book before bed. "Perhaps Mr. Preston would read to you," Lily suggested, raising a questioning eyebrow at Preston. "I'd be happy to," he agreed, following Thomas to the small trundle bed in the corner of the main room. Lily busied herself with cleaning up from dinner, but her attention was repeatedly drawn to Preston sitting on the edge of Thomas's bed, reading about a clever rabbit outwitting a fox. Her son was looking up at Preston with undisguised admiration, hanging on every word. The scene made her heart ache with a mixture of joy and wistfulness: joy at seeing Thomas so happy, wistfulness because she knew this moment was temporary. In a few days, Preston would be gone, back to his life on the trail. When the story was finished and Thomas was tucked in with his new wooden horse clutched in one hand, Preston joined Lily by the fire. The cabin was quiet now, the only sounds the crackling of the flames and Thomas's steady breathing as he drifted toward sleep. "He's a remarkable boy," Preston said softly. "Yes," Lily agreed. "He's my whole world." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both aware that the evening was drawing to a close but reluctant to end it. "Lily," Preston began, his voice low and serious, "I've been thinking." She turned to him, her heart quickening at his tone. "Yes." "I don't leave for Texas for 3 more days. I'd like to spend more time with you and Thomas, if that would be all right." The simplicity and honesty of his request touched her deeply. "We'd like that very much." Preston smiled, relief evident in his face. "Good, that's good." He stood reluctantly. "I should go. It's getting late." Lily rose as well, walking him to the door. At the threshold they paused, suddenly awkward in a way they hadn't been all evening. "Thank you for dinner," Preston said, "and for sharing your evening with me." "Thank you for the gifts," Lily replied, "and for making Thomas so happy." They stood looking at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then, with gentle deliberation, Preston reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Good night, Lily Jenkins." "Good night, Preston Evans." He released her hand slowly and turned to go, pausing at the gate to look back at her silhouetted in the doorway. With a final nod, he walked away into the gathering darkness, his mind filled with thoughts of a future he'd never considered before, a future in Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory. The next 3 days passed in a blur of shared moments and growing connection. Preston spent every available hour with Lily and Thomas, joining them for meals, helping with chores, and exploring Fort Laramie together. Each day, the bond between them strengthened, and Preston found himself increasingly reluctant to think about his impending departure. On their second day together, Preston took Thomas fishing, teaching him how to bait a hook and sit patiently by the creek that fed into the North Platte, well away from the dangerous currents that had nearly claimed the boy's life. Lily watched from a safe distance, her sewing forgotten in her lap as she observed the easy rapport between her son and this man who had so unexpectedly entered their lives. "Look, Mama," Thomas called excitedly as he pulled a small trout from the water with Preston's guidance. "I caught one." "Well done," she called back, her heart full at the sight of her son's beaming face. Preston helped Thomas remove the hook from the fish's mouth, showing him how to do it without causing unnecessary harm. "Now, what do you think? Should we keep him for dinner or let him go back to his family?" Thomas considered this seriously. "Let's let him go. He's not very big and maybe he has baby fishes waiting for him." Preston nodded solemnly. A wise decision. He helped Thomas release the fish back into the creek, both of them watching as it darted away into the clear water. When they returned to Lily, Preston's expression was soft with admiration. "You've raised a compassionate boy," he told her quietly as Thomas ran ahead to examine a colorful butterfly. "I've tried," she said. "It hasn't always been easy." "The worthwhile things rarely are," Preston replied, his eyes holding hers a moment longer than necessary. That evening, after Thomas was asleep, Lily and Preston sat outside her cabin, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. The night was cool but not cold, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Preston said after a comfortable silence. "After I return to Texas." Lily's heart constricted painfully. She had been trying not to think about his departure, now just one day away. "Oh," Preston turned to face her, his expression serious in the faint light from the cabin windows. "I've worked for the Blair outfit for 8 years. I've been saving most of my wages, thinking someday I might buy a small spread of my own." "That sounds like a fine plan," Lily said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the disappointment washing over her. Of course he had plans that didn't include Fort Laramie, didn't include her and Thomas. "The thing is," Preston continued, "I always assumed that spread would be in Texas, but lately I've been wondering if there might be opportunities elsewhere." Lily's breath caught as she began to understand what he might be suggesting. "Elsewhere?" "Wyoming Territory has good ranching land," Preston said, his eyes never leaving hers. "And Fort Laramie seems like a fine community to be part of." Hope flickered in Lily's chest, but she was cautious. She'd been disappointed before. "It is, but what about your job, your life in Texas?" "My job has been driving cattle from one place to another," Preston said with a small smile. "I've come to realize that perhaps it's time I stopped being the one always moving on." He took a deep breath. "Lily, I know we've only known each other a few days, but I feel a connection to you and Thomas that I can't explain." "I feel it too," Lily admitted softly. "But Preston, I don't want you to make decisions based on gratitude or a sense of obligation." Preston shook his head firmly. "This has nothing to do with obligation. What I feel for you, what I'm beginning to feel, it's about who you are, not what happened at the river." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. "I'm not proposing anything specific right now. That would be too soon for both of us. But I am asking if you'd be open to the possibility of me returning to Fort Laramie after this drive, of us seeing where this might lead." Lily looked down at their joined hands, his large and work roughened, hers smaller but equally marked by labor. When she raised her eyes to his again, they shone with unshed tears. "I would like that very much, Preston." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "Then that's what I'll do. I'll complete this drive, settle my affairs with the Blair outfit, and return to Fort Laramie by summer's end." "That's 3 months," Lily said, both pleased at the definiteness of his plan and disappointed at the length of time. "It is," Preston agreed. "But it will give us both time to be certain, and I'll write to you if you'll allow it." "I'd like that," Lily said, a smile spreading across her face. "Thomas will be counting the days until you return." "And you?" Preston asked, suddenly vulnerable. "Will you be counting too?" In answer, Lily leaned forward and, with a courage that surprised her, pressed her lips gently against his. The kiss was brief but full of promise, and when she pulled back, Preston's eyes were wide with wonder. "Every single day," she whispered. Their final day together was bittersweet, filled with preparations for Preston's departure and attempts to make the most of their remaining hours. Thomas was devastated to learn that Preston was leaving, but brightened considerably when told he would be returning in 3 months. "And you'll write letters?" the boy asked anxiously. "Real letters just for me." "Real letters just for you," Preston promised, ruffling Thomas's hair. "And you can practice your writing by sending me letters too. Your mother can help you with the address." As the day drew to a close, Preston presented Lily with a small package. "Something to remember me by until I return," he explained. Inside was a delicate silver chain with a small star pendant. "It's beautiful," Lily breathed, immediately putting it on. "I'll wear it every day." Their goodbye the next morning was brief but emotional. Preston embraced Thomas tightly, promising to return with stories of his journey. When he turned to Lily, words seemed inadequate for all they wanted to express. 3 months, he said simply, taking her hands in his. 3 months, she echoed, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "We'll be waiting." With one last, lingering kiss, Preston mounted his horse and rode away, turning back once to wave at the woman and child standing outside the small cabin that, in the space of a few days, had come to feel more like home than anywhere he'd been in years. True to his word, Preston wrote faithfully during his absence. His letters to Lily were filled with details of the cattle drive, descriptions of the places he passed through, and increasingly candid expressions of his feelings for her. His letters to Thomas were simpler but equally thoughtful, sometimes including small treasures like unusual rocks or pressed wildflowers. Lily replied to each letter, her initial reserve gradually giving way to open affection as the weeks passed. She told Preston about daily life in Fort Laramie, Thomas's progress in school, and her own hopes and dreams, things she'd rarely shared with anyone. As summer reached its peak, and then began to wane toward autumn, anticipation built in the small cabin on the edge of town. Thomas made a paper chain to count down the days until Preston's expected return, removing one link each morning with solemn ceremony. Then, on a crisp September afternoon, as Lily hung laundry in the yard and Thomas played with his wooden horse nearby, the sound of hoofbeats approached along the road from town. Thomas heard it first, his head shooting up like a prairie dog spotting movement. "Mama!" he shouted, already running toward the road. "Mama, it's him. It's Mr. Preston." Lily dropped the damp sheet back into the basket, her heart suddenly racing. She shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, watching as a familiar figure on horseback came into view, leading a second horse laden with packs. Preston Evans had returned to Fort Laramie. And as he swung down from his horse to sweep Thomas into a hug before turning to Lily with eyes full of emotion, she knew with absolute certainty that their lives were about to change forever. "Welcome home," she said softly, stepping into his waiting arms. "It's good to be home," Preston replied, the word home carrying a weight of meaning that made Lily's eyes fill with tears of joy. Preston's return to Fort Laramie marked the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. He rented a small room at the boarding house where Lily worked, careful to maintain propriety while courting her properly. The town watched with approval as the cowboy who had saved young Thomas Jenkins began building a life in their community. With his savings, Preston purchased a modest tract of land just outside town, 40 acres with good water access, and a sturdy, if somewhat neglected cabin. He spent the autumn making repairs and improvements, often with Thomas as his eager assistant. "Do you think we'll have cattle like the ones you used to drive?" Thomas asked one afternoon as they mended a section of fence. Preston considered the question seriously. "Some, but not as many. I'm thinking more of a mixed operation, some cattle, a few horses, maybe even sheep if the market's good. And your mother's garden will be 3 times the size once we clear that south section." Thomas looked up at him, his small face serious. "When you and Mama get married, will I call you Pa?" Preston's hand stilled on the fence post. It was the first time either Thomas or Lily had spoken so directly about the future Preston hoped for. "Would you want to?" he asked carefully. Thomas nodded emphatically. "Jimmy Patterson has a pa, and so does William Booker. I'd like to have one too." Emotion welled in Preston's chest. "Well," he said, his voice slightly rough, "if your mother agrees to marry me and if you'd like to call me Pa, I'd be honored. But you know, no matter what you call me, I already care about you as if you were my own son." Thomas beamed and returned to his task with renewed vigor, while Preston found himself thinking about timing and rings and the best way to ask Lily Jenkins to become his wife. The opportunity presented itself a week later, during Fort Laramie's Autumn Harvest Festival. The town square was decorated with corn stalks and pumpkins, and tables laden with food stretched along one side. There was music and dancing, children playing games, and a general atmosphere of community celebration. Preston had arranged everything carefully, enlisting Mrs. Hollister's help to keep Thomas occupied at a certain time. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, he found Lily watching the dancing, her face glowing in the warm light. "May I have this dance?" he asked, extending his hand. Lily smiled and allowed him to lead her into the square where other couples were moving to the music of fiddles and a harmonica. Preston wasn't an accomplished dancer, but he moved with the natural grace that characterized all his physical activities. Lily followed his lead easily, her green calico skirt swirling around her ankles. "You look beautiful today," Preston said, admiring the way she'd arranged her hair with a few late wildflowers. "Thank you," Lily replied, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. Even after months of courtship, his compliments still had the power to fluster her. As the song ended, Preston didn't release her hand. Instead, he led her away from the dancers toward a quiet corner of the square where a large old cottonwood tree spread its branches. From his pocket, he produced a small wooden box. "Lily," he said, suddenly nervous despite all his planning, "these past months have been the happiest of my life. Finding you and Thomas, it was like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." Lily's eyes widened as she began to understand what was happening. Around them, the festival continued, but it seemed to recede into the background, as if they were in a world of their own. "When I jumped into that river to save Thomas, I had no idea I was also saving myself," Preston continued, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "I was just a drifter, moving from place to place without real purpose. But you've given me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the late afternoon sunlight. "Lily Jenkins, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of allowing me to be a father to Thomas and a husband to you for all the days of our lives?" Tears spilled down Lily's cheeks as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Preston, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, cheers erupted around them. They looked up to discover that their private moment had acquired an audience including Thomas, who broke away from Mrs. Hollister to throw himself at both of them in an exuberant hug. "Does this mean you're going to be my pa now?" he asked Preston excitedly. "It sure does," Preston confirmed, lifting the boy into his arms. "If that's all right with you, it's the best thing ever," Thomas declared, wrapping his arms around Preston's neck. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, well wishes, and plans for the future. Reverend Collins, the local minister, suggested a date in early November for the wedding, giving them just enough time to prepare without having to wait too long. "There's no sense in a lengthy engagement at your ages," he said with a practical nod. "And it'll be good to have the ceremony before winter sets in properly." As they walked home that night, Thomas running ahead in the moonlight, Preston and Lily discussed their plans. They would live in the cabin on Preston's newly acquired land, combining their households and their lives. "It's not much yet," Preston admitted. "But given time, it's perfect," Lily interrupted, squeezing his hand. "It's more than I ever dreamed of having again." Preston stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I want you to know that I understand what a leap of faith this is for you, Lily, after what happened with Thomas's father. Well, I just want you to know that I will spend every day of our lives together proving that your faith in me is justified." Lily's expression softened. "I already know that, Preston. You're the most honorable man I've ever known. When you jumped into that river for a child you'd never met, you showed me everything I needed to know about your character." She reached up to touch his cheek gently. "And these past months, watching you with Thomas, seeing how you keep every promise no matter how small. I have no doubts about you, Preston Evans. None at all." Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, with the distant mountains already capped with snow. The small church in Fort Laramie was decorated with evergreen boughs and the last of the autumn flowers, gathered by the ladies of the town as a gift to the bride. Lily wore a dress of deep blue, wool new for the occasion, with her mother's lace collar carefully attached at the neckline. Her hair was arranged simply but elegantly, with a crown of small white flowers that Mrs. Hollister had somehow managed to preserve past their season. Thomas, scrubbed clean and solemn with the importance of his role, served as ring-bearer, carrying the simple gold bands on a small cushion sewn by the schoolteacher, Miss Winters. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, and Preston kissed his bride with tender reverence, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. The celebration afterward was typical of Fort Laramie, practical but generous, with everyone contributing what they could to the wedding feast. There was music and dancing, speeches and toasts, and through it all, an undercurrent of genuine pleasure in seeing two people who deserved happiness find it with each other. As evening approached, the newlyweds thanked their guests and prepared to leave for their new home. Thomas had already been settled there by Mrs. Hollister, who had offered to stay with him for the first part of the evening to allow the couple some time alone. Preston helped Lily into the wagon he decorated with pine boughs and ribbons, and they set off through town toward their land. As the sounds of the celebration faded behind them, Lily leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in a way she hadn't been in years. "Happy, Mrs. Evans?" Preston asked, putting his arm around her. Lily smiled at the new name. "Happier than I ever thought possible." When they arrived home, their home now, truly, Preston surprised Lily by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. She laughed in delight, wrapping her arms around his neck. The cabin had been transformed in anticipation of their return. A fire burned cheerfully in the hearth, and someone, probably Mrs. Hollister, had scattered fragrant pine needles across the plank floor. On the table stood a small cake and a bottle of wine wedding gifts from Mr. Miller at the general store. Thomas came running to greet them, already in his nightshirt but far too excited to sleep. "Is it official now? Are we really a family?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. "We really are," Preston confirmed, setting Lily gently on her feet but keeping an arm around her waist. "The most official family in all of Wyoming Territory," Lily added, opening her arms to include Thomas in their embrace. That night, after Thomas finally succumbed to sleep in his new room, a small addition Preston had built onto the cabin during the autumn, husband and wife stood together by the fire, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "If you hadn't been in Fort Laramie that day," Lily said softly, "if you hadn't been brave enough to jump into that river." Preston pulled her closer. "I believe we would have found each other somehow, Lily Evans. Some things are just meant to be." As he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, Lily knew he was right. What had begun in crisis had transformed into the greatest blessing of her life. And as the fire crackled and the Wyoming wind sang around their snug cabin, she gave thanks for the current that had nearly taken her son, but had instead delivered the love of her life. The years that followed were filled with the rich tapestry of family life on the Wyoming frontier. Preston's small ranch prospered under his careful management, growing gradually as he was able to purchase additional land from neighbors who decided to move on. Lily's garden expanded as planned, providing not only for their family but yielding enough excess to sell or trade in town. Thomas thrived with Preston as his father, learning the skills of ranching and developing a particularly keen eye for horseflesh. By the time he was 12, he was helping Preston train the horses they raised, showing a natural affinity that made Preston swell with pride. In the spring of 1878, almost 3 years after Preston had pulled Thomas from the river, Lily gave birth to their first child together, a son they named William James Evans, with a shock of dark hair like his father's and his mother's determined spirit. Thomas took to big brotherhood with enthusiasm, teaching little Will everything he deemed important as soon as the baby was old enough to toddle after him. 2 years later, the family welcomed a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, who from her earliest days showed signs of inheriting her mother's practical nature and her father's quiet strength. With her arrival, their family felt complete, balanced, and blessed in ways that sometimes still amazed both Preston and Lily when they reflected on the unlikely path that had brought them together. Life wasn't always easy. There were hard winters when the snow piled high and the cattle needed extra care to survive. There were dry summers when the garden struggled and the creek that watered their land dwindled to a trickle. There was the year of the grasshopper plague, when the insects devoured crops across the territory, forcing everyone to tighten their belts and share what little they had. But through it all, the Evans family remained resilient, their bond strengthening with each challenge overcome. Preston and Lily's partnership deepened into the kind of love that needs few words, a love expressed in small daily kindnesses, in the way they anticipated each other's needs, in the quiet conversations by the fire after the children were asleep. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall like Preston but with Lily's green eyes and quick smile. By 18, he was effectively managing half the ranch operations, showing a head for business that complemented Preston's practical experience. When he began courting Mary Calloway, the daughter of the boarding house owner where Lily had once worked, both Preston and Lily gave their blessing with full hearts. On a warm summer evening in 1893, as they sat on the porch of the expanded and improved cabin that had been their home for almost 2 decades, Preston took Lily's hand in his, running his thumb over the simple gold band he'd placed there so many years before. "Do you ever think about that day at the river?" he asked quietly. Lily leaned her head against his shoulder, her once dark hair now streaked with silver that matched the distinguished gray at Preston's temples. "Sometimes. Less often now than in the early years." From inside the house came the sound of Sarah practicing on the piano they'd splurged on for her 16th birthday, while Will and Thomas could be seen in the distance, checking the fence line before dusk. "I used to have nightmares about it," Lily continued. "About what might have happened if you hadn't been there. But now, when I think of that day, I mostly feel gratitude." Preston nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "It's strange how life works. One moment can change everything." "For the better in our case," Lily said, turning to smile at him. "Definitely for the better," Preston agreed, leaning in to kiss her softly. Even after all these years, the connection between them remained as strong as ever, a love born in crisis, but built on respect, partnership, and unwavering commitment. As the Wyoming sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Preston and Lily Evans sat together in the life they had created, surrounded by the legacy of that fateful day when a desperate mother's cries had drawn a cowboy to a river's edge. What had begun as a rescue had become a romance, then a marriage, then a family, and finally, a lifetime of love that neither had expected but both had embraced with their whole hearts. And somewhere in the gentle evening breeze, in the rustling of the cottonwood leaves and the distant murmur of the North Platte River, there seemed to be a whisper of destiny fulfilled, a reminder that sometimes the current of life carries us exactly where we need to be.